Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having us. So I'm Matt Leacock,
Okay.
and
And I'm Matteo. Nice to meet you all.
yeah, and today we're
So,
going to be discussing Daybreak. Do you want to set us up, Matteo?
yeah, sure. Just as a warning, Matt, I cannot see you. I can only see the presentation. So
Okay.
it's a little bit like I'm talking to my screen, but I can see you. So at some point, I will have to say maybe next slide or that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah,
And
that's
I
fine.
cannot see your facial expression or anyone's facial expression for that matter. Cool. So yeah, today we're going to talk about how we've been designing Daybreak and how we've been trying to model the global climate crisis in a board game. So and how we think that playing a board game can inspire a deeper involvement in climate work and climate action. So moving on to the next slide. Why do we think that games can be useful in this context? So, as probably some of you know, games are very powerful because, unlike other media, when we play, we shape the story and instead of just consuming it. So we're actively making choices. We are stepping out of our daily lives and we are immersing ourselves in a different world, which has different rules and different roles. And those rules and those roles are defined by the game designers, by someone like me and Matt. And so we have this privilege, in a sense, to be able to decide what to include in the game world, what to leave out, and also to tell players what they should care about through the point system. So games are very powerful because through games we can map systems and we can make them understandable. If we give people a safe space where they can make choices, they can try out different things, they can make mistakes, and that is a really useful place for them to explore things that they might want to or they might want to try also in the real world. So games are really useful at mapping systems. And an example of a system that games have been mapping for a long time is Monopoly. So you may know that Monopoly was invented as a political game. It was invented by this lady called Elizabeth Maggie, and she was campaigning for a policy called the land value tax, and she could have wrote a pamphlet, she could have wrote a novel or a book about monopolies, but instead she decided to make a game to give people a practical understanding of the system of the property market, or the land grabbing, as she called it, so that people would understand different approaches to property ownership and what that means for society in general. So Maggie designed what she called the landlord's game, and the landlord's game had two different sets of rules. The first one, called the monopolist, which modeled the reality of the property market. And it pretty much played like the Monopoly game that we all have at least once played and probably hated a bit. I hate Monopoly. And then the second rule set was called prosperity. And this rule set modeled a policy that she was campaigning for, the land value tax, and a vision for a fair society. So every time that someone bought a property, they had to pay a tax, which was then redistributed throughout players. And the game was won when the player that started with the lowest income doubled their income. So this was a way to model a system that would result from the implementation of that policy that she was campaigning for. So the game was relatively popular in progressive circles. This was 1904, so the beginning of the 20th century. And 30 years after Maggie invented this game, the patent ran out and it was bought up by a company which decided to strip away all of the progressive political content and repackage it as Monopoly, which is the game that we all know. And it's kind of funny and sad at the same time that this game that started off as a political campaign tool then became a celebration, if you like, of capitalism. And
I'm gonna go sad
so,
there, Matteo. I'm gonna go
yeah,
sad.
sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Definitely sad. Yeah. So this is an example of how games can be used to model a system and to get players to step into different roles. So when you play Monopoly, you can either play the role of the ruthless capitalist that tries to bankrupt everyone, your friends, your family, no matter what, or you could play the role of someone who redistributes the wealth that is created through the property market. Now, moving on. You gonna take that, Matt?
Oh, right. Yeah. So, I mean, if we look back at Monopoly, we had the competitive version and the cooperative version. Um, so I get this question all the time, like why cooperative games? What is it about cooperation? And one of the things I like to say, and I've realized over time, is that most of life is cooperative. I mean, we live in a society, we're all working together, so much so that it's like I guess it's like the water that fish swim in. It's everywhere. You don't see it, so you take it for granted. And so it's such a big part of life. Why don't we have games that sort of model this? We have so many competitive games. You go back to chess, Go, et cetera. The earliest games are all competitive. And I think my hunch is that competitive games are just easier to design. As a game designer, you only need to make a playing field, and then um, the opponents, 2 people or 2 to 4, however many people, bring their own brains and they supply a lot of the intelligence for the game. And so, as a game designer, you can rely on the opponent to provide a lot of the to provide what you're pushing against. And in a cooperative game, you actually have to create that antagonist. You have to like program them with, in some cases, like with board games, with cardboard and paper pieces. You have to like embody an enemy, and that's difficult. So I think what's happened recently is that game designers have actually gotten better at making cooperative games that actually have real high stakes and engagement and emotional involvement and so on. And we're starting to see more cooperative games come on the scene. Um, and this is great because competitive games model like zero-sum environments where there's always a loser and there's a winner. And so, like I was saying before, there's so much of life is cooperative, and we rely on each other. And one of the other advantages is that cooperative games allow you to set the stage where you can have lots of people coming together to tackle really big systemic, wicked problems. For example,
Yeah.
uh,
So if you remember what happened 2 years ago, and something happened. I'm gonna try not to say that name, but maybe I'm gonna use a name that starts with those words like Panasonic or Panettone. So in 2020, we suddenly had a big problem, and that problem was something that has been previously modeled in a game. In fact, the game that Matt designed. So moving on
Yeah, here we
to the
go.
next
So
slide.
this is Pandemic. So I came up with this game in 2004. I started on it and worked on it for a few years, and it came out in 2008. This is back when I thought pandemics were things that happened to other people somewhere else in the world. And then in 2020 came around, and it hit me right at home here. But briefly, Pandemic is a game where all the players work together. They all cooperate in order to fight 4 deadly diseases that are like spreading across the globe and threatening humanity. And the players have to treat the diseases, treat these uh, hotspots before they turn into outbreaks and make the situation really bad. So they have to keep that at bay, and while at the same time they're trying to discover the cures for the diseases. And if you and your fellow players can discover the 4 cures before time runs out, then you all win the game. And the moral of this game is that really you all have to work together to overcome this bigger threat. And if you play this game and you're only looking after your own self-interest, or you're narrowly looking at just what you yourself are doing and not cooperating or communicating with other people, then you're definitely gonna lose the game. And so that's it. It really kind of teaches you how vital communication is, and pushing back against a greater, powerful enemy. And so I took a lot of those thoughts about the game and related it to the current situation back in 2020, as my family got infected right away, and wrote it up into an op-ed for the New York Times, just kind of talking about thoughts of like what the game teaches us about how to address these types of big systemic issues. And so I wrote that up, and then I think Matteo saw it.
Yeah, yeah. And then I had written a similar blog post earlier, and a friend of mine pointed me to the article that Matt wrote for the New York Times. So I decided to reach out on Twitter. At the time, we didn't know each other. So we started a conversation about what we can learn from the game, and what generally we can learn from cooperative games, and what cooperative games can help us create as a system for players to explore and to tackle these bigger problems. And that conversation led to another bigger problem that we both were considering at the time. So both Matt and I were thinking about the climate crisis. If you remember, 2019 had seen an explosion of movements like the climate strikes and Extinction Rebellions, and climate emergencies being declared around the world. So it was kind of in the air, and we thought that maybe there is a role that we as game designers can play in this. So the question was, what can we do as creatives, as game designers, and perhaps that was making a game about the climate crisis. So moving on, we started a conversation, a weekly call on Skype, and one of the first questions that we asked ourselves was, how do we even frame a huge issue like the climate crisis? And something that we both were frustrated and still are frustrated about is how often climate action is framed as an individual action person. So the responsibility is down to the individual, or the consumer rather. And so whenever you look at what can I do about climate change, you often hear things like eat less meat, take less flights, or even have less babies. And all of those things are potentially impactful, but not enough to match the scale of the problem. So we know that the climate crisis is a global problem that impacts everyone on the planet, especially communities in the global south who are at least responsible for it. And we know that it's not enough to just eat less meat, or to do those ethical consumerism steps to tackle this and to match the scale of it. So one of the first things that we agreed on was that we wanted to have this global systemic frame to the game that we were starting to dream about at that point. And the next thing that we wanted to do was to give players a visceral understanding of the driver of climate breakdown. And as you probably can imagine from playing board games, you cannot rely on powerful computers, you cannot rely on artificial intelligence, you have to rely on people's brains to operate the system that you create on the board. And so it has to be very simple. And that, in a sense, is an advantage, because we can take something complex like climate models and then try to simplify it to what is the essential components of it. And so if we take climate breakdown, for instance, a simple model is that you have greenhouse gas emissions, which are mostly produced by burning fossil fuels, that trap heat in the atmosphere, which then drives up global temperatures, and that makes the weather, let's say the climate, more extreme and unpredictable, and destabilizes general planetary systems. So we decided that we would try and model this global dynamic of emissions accumulating in the atmosphere and driving this destabilization in a way that was both visceral, so that people would feel the threat of this piling up of emissions, and also to try and be as accurate as possible. And so that was our second question, if you like. The third question was, who or what is the enemy that you're playing against? And here we could have done a game where you play, for instance, one player as the fossil fuel industry, or one player as the evil, and everyone else together trying to solve the problem. But we wanted to tell a different story about the climate crisis. We wanted to start from the assumption that world leaders have already been pressured to take the climate crisis seriously. And so the idea was to create a game where people can explore a situation where global leaders have already been pressured to work together. And at that point, if we assume this global cooperation, what would it take to actually solve the climate crisis? Because for so long, the climate crisis has been so marginal to the debate that we haven't even allowed ourselves to imagine what could possibly happen when you have powerful interests, when you have different countries, a different coalition of countries coming together to actually take that crisis seriously, and to not just make promises about net zero in however many years, but to tackle it now. So this means that we are assuming total cooperation between players. So this is going to be a fully cooperative game. Everyone is working together. And that is a big assumption to make, and also quite a big leap from what we can see as the current reality of geopolitical competition. But we also think that it's important for players to imagine an alternative vision of what the future could be, and then after they play the game, try to take action, or to pressure their elected leaders to take action, and to bring whatever they experience in the game into the real world. So given these initial design decisions that we made, so systemic frame, global coalition of players working together, it makes sense that we would frame the players as countries or coalitions of countries that work together. So generally, you have 4 players in the typical board game. And so we decided to start with a list of 4. And in our game, the 4 players are the US, China, Europe, and the Global South. So US, China, and Europe are existing countries or existing unions, whereas the Global South is not a political unit, although they often negotiate at UN level as a group. They're sometimes called the G77. And beside that, we also wanted to give a seat at the table to the people that are mostly affected by the climate crisis, while being the least responsible for it. And then through playtesting later on, we started talking to people from the Global South, and they suggested that we use the term majority world instead, which is a term that has been coined by someone in the Global South to define themselves as the majority of the world.
Yeah, right. Right, so we have all the players now in this global frame, and basically we can kind of jump into how the game models what's going on in the world then. So basically what the game is showing is that you've got the 4 different players who are all generating tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And these are represented by little brown cubes or gray cubes that generate. And every round you take a big handful of these from your dirty electricity production and all the emissions from all the different various sectors of your economy. You take this massive amount and you throw them into the atmosphere at the top of the board here. This is actually a very early sketch of our game board. This is from almost 2 years ago.
May, yeah,
Yeah,
May 2020.
right. So these they get tossed onto the board. Some of them get sequestered by the earth and the oceans, and the remainder get thrown onto the thermometer over there on the right. And the thermometer basically represents 2 things. One is the cumulative emissions over time, so all this CO2 and other greenhouse gases accumulating over time. And as those accumulate, it pushes the temperature up, and that has bad side effects. And we really want to, one of the things we keyed on very early on is that you get this visceral feeling as you see all of this stuff getting piled into the atmosphere and accumulating over time. And your objective then is to try to reduce the emissions on any given round to net zero. Basically, you throw some emissions in there, and enough of them are sequestered that you have 0 or fewer net emissions, then you win the game. So that's pretty much where we started at. And I'll go ahead and click next here. And this is the game board. We've got, this is our latest prototype before going into production.
Yeah, and as you can see, the central elements are still the same as 2 years ago, although graphically they're slightly changed, but there is still the engine of threats, which is modeling global carbon emissions, which is still there in the center of the board. So you have emissions piling up into the atmosphere, some of them get sequestered, and the rest, the net emissions, go and push up the global temperatures, and that triggers a series of planetary effects, which are large global destabilization that can scope from the loss of Arctic sea ice to melting permafrost, desertification, and so on. And then you have a growing number of crises that range from extreme weather events to social, political, economical crises. So these are the bad things that can happen, and we wanted players to understand. So we started by modeling how people could lose the game in a sense. Mm-hmm. And in our first prototypes, we were concentrating on how to reduce the emissions. So if on the one hand, the threat engine was pushing up emissions, so emissions that push up the temperatures that create the conditions for people to lose the game, then our initial model was to let players work with 2 different currencies: financial capital and political power. So that would be allocated an initial budget, and then they would be able to spend that budget over different policies and technologies that would allow them to, on the one hand, reduce the production of dirty energy, increase the amount of clean energy that they are producing to offset the commissioning of dirty energy, while also reducing the carbon emissions from other sources like agriculture, industry, and so on. So as you see, that's a screenshot of a very early player board and a sample of the cards that we had at the beginning. And so people would spend a mixture of financial capital and political power in order to roll out these policies and technologies that would allow them to shift from the status quo of high dirty energy production and high emissions to, hopefully within a certain time frame, less emissions and more clean energy. However, so we started playing these early prototypes, and there were a lot of question marks around them. That most of the time it felt like we were playing with a deck of improv cards over a map of the world. But there was something quite compelling we observed from playtesters about working together to shrink that big pile of carbon cubes from the atmosphere round after round. And as the temperature cubes were going up, the weather events were becoming more extreme, and so they were making the efforts of players harder and harder. So at that point, the lost condition was that if the temperature got too high, say we even set it actually to
Yeah.
2 degrees or anywhere, but we created a system that was so punishing at some point that around 2 degrees you would practically have no chance to win. But so as we were playtesting these initial prototypes, we realized that it felt quite like a technocratic puzzle, and it was all about decarbonizing the global economy. And so it was getting quite tricky to come up with ideas for more cards, and we realized that our model at that point only counted for emissions. So we had a hand that the game should be not just about reducing emissions, so it shouldn't be just a war on carbon, but it should also be about protecting lives and transforming societies. So at that point, we decided to introduce a new concept, and really to center people, so that instead of losing because the temperature got too high to this kind of arbitrary number, or because you run out of time, you would lose because you have failed to protect people, to protect human beings. And therefore, if we were to set the loss of people as the main loss condition, that created a new space for us to design around what would it mean to protect those people. And that means in the jargon of climate people, adaptation. So on the one hand, you have mitigation, which is the reduction of carbon emissions and the reduction of the root cause of the problem. On the other hand, you have to protect people from this growing number of crises, and you do that, generally speaking, by increasing social resilience, so increasing the social safety nets around your around communities. You do that by protecting biodiversity and the environment, so ecological resilience, and also you do that by increasing the resilience of your infrastructure, of your built environment. So to summarize, what the game become is about 3 key concepts. The first is mitigation, so removing the sources of emissions as much as possible. The second is adaptation, so protecting our society from the impacts of climate breakdown. But in order to enable mitigation and adaptation at the scale that is required by the climate crisis, we also need to transform society. So we need to build enough power and enough change to not just tweak things on the margin, but to actually make big transformative changes to our economies, to our societies, which allow us to make that mitigation and adaptation possible. So let's look at how that looks like in practice on the game board. Want to take that, Matt?
Yeah, I can do that. So, yeah, the game presents a lot of tensions in the game. Like, you've got to meet an internal electricity demand. So if you look at this board here, you can see that there's a little blue circle there. It shows how much electricity you need to meet every single round, and you're meeting that by producing dirty and clean electricity, and that continuously grows. So you have to continually meet electricity needs. And one of the main things that we talked about was mitigation, like drawing down the amount of carbon that you produce every round. So in game terms, that means you want to get rid of as many of those gray tokens as possible. You want to get rid of your dirty energy plants, and you want to get rid of the sources of carbon, whether it's industry or transportation or buildings or what have you there. And you can see that already that creates problems. If you start getting rid of dirty electricity plants, you're not going to meet your demand. So you got to work that tension out. And then you've got a bunch of communities that are in crisis, and this is sort of like the primary game loss condition. You have to protect your people, and as the temperature rises on that thermometer, you're going to be getting more and more crises, and the severity of those crises are going to get bigger and bigger. In order to combat that and protect people, you need to invest in adaptation. And that means like increasing your social, ecological, and infrastructure resilience, which is tracked on the bottom there of the player board. So that's kind of, in gamer speak, that's kind of like your armor. So we put it in little shields. So you build that up. There's another tension in like trying to act in the present versus in the future. So you could make short-term gains in adaptation and in mitigation and so on by just burning your cards. These are player cards along the top, or opportunity cards, I should say. There's 5 of them up top. These are the projects that you've got rolled out. You can do short-term things and just spend a card and create an electricity plant, a clean electricity plant, or spend a card and get rid of a dirty electricity plant. And you get immediate, tangible benefits from that that are done early on. So you're going to reap that benefit over the course of the rest of the game because you won't have the dirty power plant for like 5 or 6 rounds. But the other tension is if you invest in things and make them more efficient, you invest in technologies, you can make all of those activities even more efficient over the long term. So it's basically this tension generating machine. And one of the other simplifications we made, if you remember back to an earlier prototype, we had political power and financial capital, and we actually had a whiteboard to track all this stuff. We've managed to simplify that all down into just one currency. It's just these cards. So if you look at this next slide here, you can actually spend the cards. You can roll them out to create a new action for your players. So in this case, a way to roll out resilience much faster each round. Or you can tuck a card behind another card in order to invest in an existing one. So here you're going to be making this card that you just rolled out more efficient. And then over time, you build up these large tableaus or play areas full of these cards, and you start to see how the system all works together. How a policy that like helps you invest in your society might power an action that helps with adaptation, for example. Or you can go very deep in a clean energy stack to make clean electricity production much more efficient. So by like bringing it all down into cards, we're able to really efficiently give the player lots and lots of trade-offs and present a system where everything is kind of interconnected. So let's see. So you really need to build up these tableaus, and in so doing, you start to see this systemic transformation, and you start to see all the different aspects that you need to put together in order to solve the puzzle. And I should mention, while you're doing this, each player is doing this on their own board. You are cooperating with the other world powers. You might have a need that another player can help with, and someone else might have a problem that they can raise their hand and ask for assistance with, and you can find ways to transfer things between players. So we're also trying to model the way we'd like to see or we like the players to envision things actually happening. We're trying to picture this brighter future as opposed to modeling all the oppositional forces that are sort of in the way.
Yeah, and there are no fixed turns in Daybreak, so everyone can play at the same time. And whenever you play around an actual table, there's this beautiful atmosphere of having multiple conversations flowing at the same time, and it can feel quite messy and quite chaotic sometimes, but when it works, it's really beautiful. So where we are at the moment is we're working with artists to start visualizing what all of the different policies, the different technologies, also the different cards that represent the crisis that I mentioned earlier. And we have about 200 of those policies, technologies, crises, global projects, and so on. And this is an example of an early sketch for air pollution. So in this case, for instance, air pollution is impacting the player that has the highest transportation emissions, and that player would have to endanger, so to put one community in crisis per temperature band. So at the beginning of the game, you have a very low global warming temperature, so that air pollution will be relatively harmless. But the higher the temperature, the more harm that crisis will do. And as you can see also in that image, you can protect yourself by tacking cards from anyone's deck, from anyone's hand. So that's another way in which players are incentivized to collaborate. So to give up some of their opportunities, some of their cards, in order to protect other people from the impacts of those crises that become more and more intense and frequent as the temperature go up. And because the lost condition is that if any player at any point has 12 communities in crisis, no matter how well the other players are doing, everyone loses. So that is a really strong incentive for everyone to care about how everyone else is doing. So this is an example of where we are at the moment with the art. And we have a big database of cards. As you can see there are local project cards. These are the small cards that players play on their own board. Then you have the global project cards, which are the ones that can have big impacts on the whole game. And then you have crisis cards. And we're working at the moment with experts from the Red Cross Climate Crisis to Laurie Laymore Langton, who is the author of this book, Planet on Fire. And they've been helping us to translate the mechanics and the dynamics of the game into real world policies, and to also inform how we are going to visualize those. And eventually those that database can also be used as a source that people can access while playing the game or after playing the game. If you go back one slide, Matt, you can see
right. Yeah, the QR code
there is a QR code. So every card will have a QR code that will take you to a page or a section of a page where people will be able to learn more about, for instance, what does air pollution mean, how does it affect people, and what can you do about it.
Right.
So to conclude, we have an online version of Daybreak that can be played on a tool called playingcards.io. If you look at that URL, you will get a guide, a step-by-step guide on how to set up a virtual room. This is a free tool that you can play online over a video call, and we encourage everyone to try it if you want. And then, of course, we have also a physical prototype.
We have 7 of these, I think, actually. They're traveling around the globe right now for getting playtest feedback. Yeah, but that's where we're at right now. Yeah.
Yep.
I'll reappear. Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. So we've got, I'm just looking at the clock. I'm trying to look at the clock. We've got about a quarter of an hour or so to take questions. So I've written down loads. I'll try and not abuse the position I'm in of just asking my questions. If any of you want to ask questions, you could either post them in the chat or put the little hand up if you can find one, and we can call and you can ask in person. While we wait for that, Chloe, do you want to ask your question? I can see that you've posted one in the chat. Or I can read it out. I'll read it out, and then let's see. So Chloe has asked, I'm interested in the messy anarchic play of no fixed turns. This energy is what's needed to drive real change, rather than, as you say, tinkering. How do you provide the kind of, sorry, it's moving up, it's hard to read. How do you provide that kind of transformative force within the economic systems you're modeling in the project cards and game mechanics? I guess there's two kind of related things to talk about. One is the kind of anarchy or messiness of the turn sequence or not turn sequence, and the other is how do you model this kind of change in the mechanics and cards that you've developed?
Yeah, there is a real frenetic kind of chaotic energy because you deal out the opportunity cards to everyone. They've got their own tableau or their own hand of cards and their own projects, and you just get invested in what you're doing yourself. But at the same time, if you want to win, you do want to know what's going on amongst all the other players. But the problem is so complicated that if you tried to analyze the entire table's state, your head would blow up. I've solo tested a 4-player game, and it's extremely difficult. I mean, I feel like I need to take a nap after I play a couple rounds because it's so much to take in. So it's this very chaotic thing of trying to deal with your own local problems and communicating with other people to make sure that they're doing all right and looking for opportunities and so on. And yeah, it's got a real energy to it, which I think really comes through. I think we've kind of cracked the I want to care about my stuff, but also care about what's happening around the world.
Yeah, and so in a way also that shortens the time that people play, and because you don't have to wait for other people to take their turns before you can take yours, so that makes play flow faster. And also I think it adds to that tension of that Matt talked about in terms of I want to care about my part of the world and my emissions and my people, versus I need to also look at what other people are doing, because if I don't, there's a good chance that we're going to screw the whole world. So yeah, this kind of came out of we probably did it from the very beginning. We just decided that there wouldn't be fixed turns, and we decided to see what would happen.
When we
and
started, it was even
right.
more open. It was so open. It was too much. So we had to figure out the right level of restrictions in order to make the whole thing processable by a human brain. And I think we found the sweet spot.
Yeah, and we also introduced a step called the conference, because we realized at some point that this pull towards caring about your own part of the world was quite strong, and people would realize that having some sort of coordination, some sort of strategizing together is useful, but they only would realize it maybe after they lost the first game. So we introduced a step at the very beginning of each round and we called it conference, which is a reference to things like the COP conferences, where people come together and they draw 2 of those global projects. You can see them in the image, those green cards. And the green cards can be things like, let's roll out solar at scale, or let's give all migrants all around the world the same rights that we can accept them, or give them sort of refugee status in wherever they need to be. And so what that does is focusing the conversation around what is the priority for the group, and also gives people a way to exchange a bit of information before they draw their opportunity cards, the blue cards, and then move on to then focusing back on their side, on their corner of the world.
I can cover the second part of the question real briefly. Around Transformative Force, it's generally about, it's like an engine building game, essentially. So you can do things inefficiently early on and reap the rewards for the rest of the game, or you can spend a little bit of time investing to make like this nonlinear growth. So you can invest heavily in solar or wind, for example, and the costs for clean energy drop significantly and quickly. So you start to see these nonlinear I don't know. You feel really powerful. Let's put it that way. There's this emotional connection you've got with feeling like you can tackle the problem and become more and more powerful as the game progresses. While at the same time, the temperature is going up, and your adversary, the climate, is pushing back at a nonlinear way as well. And so it's this race between these 2 different curves.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm just looking at the chat. So Helen Peebles asked a couple of questions. Do you want to come on mic and ask them, Helen, or shall I read them? I'm not sure how you'll tell me without coming on mic. I'll ask the first one anyway, which is about taking, you probably read it as well. So about taking the game to COP27 and seeing if you can get world leaders to play it. I mean, there's lots of different games being used to try and engage policymakers to explain to them how the science behind climate action that they are relatively unaware of. I think is there any intention to take this to sort of spaces like that?
Well, I mean, we've made some inroads. I guess we've got a few members of John Kerry's team who've played it. So I don't know if they've actually taken it to COP. Do you remember? Did they actually go so far as to take a copy?
No, they haven't. No, they haven't taken it to COP because we made contact with them after COP 26.
Right.
But there is a chance that they might take it to COP 27. We'll see.
Right.
But
But we
yeah,
have
definitely we're interested in that kind of engagement.
There's I'm trying to remember what it's called. I know there's a project at Utrecht University. I think it's called Anticiplay, and it's about playing games and trying to communicate. I'll send you I'll find out the proper reference rather than mislead you, but it's around games and policymakers and how they might be used. So that it's really interesting. Oh, things are going uphill. I've got to scroll back up now. So I think where am I? So yeah, Helen had another question, which was about modeling energy demand. So it says, do you challenge our social or cultural assumptions of energy demand or need within the game, or is there basically an assumption of energy demand based on population? So how are you? I mean, one of the questions I suppose I was thinking that relates to maybe is it following the models we have already, or are you thinking of alternatives to the current ways that we use energy and conceive of it?
Well, I think the first thing, we're trying to be realistic and model a lot of the inertia in the system. We're not pretending that you can like play a card and suddenly, consumerism and capitalism have radically changed. So you do have to fight back against this energy growth that's happening at the end of every round. But we do have opportunities that reduce that demand. So you can get a sense for, we can argue about like how big that effect should be, but you can kind of model, okay, what would happen if this demand shrank a bit by playing certain opportunity cards during play. And so one game you might have less demand, and another game you might be spending more energy on mitigation, for example. So the game does address it in its model. It's not saying that this is the only way to do it. It's saying it's a way, and then we make kind of I think we make a statement by the card distribution and the effects strength and so on as to what we think like that force could be, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So our data models are based on climate watch data. So we took the most recent emission data and the most recent growth, what's it called, predictions into the future, and we kind of bake those into the game. And then, as Matt said, as you play, you're working against that initial use as usual scenario and its inertia to try and go against it. And there are some ways within the game where you can slow down growth, for instance, but that's not the only way that you can play, because we want people to be able to explore all different kinds of combinations.
So that Matteo, that leads really nicely into a question that Charlotte's asked in the chat, which is about she asks, during playtests have specific tactics emerged in the game? So I mean, I guess you've constructed a model of a particular system, which may or may not, I guess, privilege different types of action. So I mean, have you noticed different strategies emerging in the way the game's been played that are successful or less successful?
Yeah, I guess that the whole point was to try to generate, I'd like to think of it as like a counterfactual engine. It produces lots of potential futures that you can try out. And so some players really go for aggressive decarbonization right away, risking their populations, while others invest more heavily in adaptation and have a more gradual approach. And we're trying to make, a lot of these strategies viable. Others are more technocratic, and they'll go after like geoengineering solutions and all sorts of, go really heavy in nuclear and so on. I don't know if there's one like go-to strategy, but we're basically trying to find a lot of ones that are all viable. Have you seen any, Matteo, that really stand out?
No, there aren't any strategies that would be always working or always winning.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
would
one
consider that
thing
like a
that,
failure of the
because
system, right? Because
that
we're trying to show lots
that
of
would be,
potential
yeah, that would
futures.
yeah, and also that would probably not be a good game.
Yeah,
If you had one way to solve it. But then one thing that we can say about the emerging strategy is that generally early action is much more effective than waiting. And this is something that we have
yeah,
observed in playtest sometimes when people think that they feel like they could keep cards from one round to another. I mean, they actually can do that, and we don't set any restrictions as to how big your hand should be or how many cards you can keep from one round to the other. So there is a bit of a temptation to say, well, if I don't play this card now, I can keep it later, because maybe with another card I will draw in the future, I could make my actions more efficient, or I can make my engine more efficient. But meanwhile, the emissions are piling up, and the cost or the loss of not acting early is that you're losing time, and you're losing the ability to kind of compound the benefits of the action that you could have done, perhaps more costly in terms of card spend early on. So yeah, long story short, early action is generally better than waiting and kind of kicking the can down the road.
Sounds good. So I was just looking at, there's a couple of sort of very complimentary posts that I'll let you read and enjoy at your own leisure. But in the interest of time, I can see that the last question I can see is from Tom, who asks a question that's been +1 by other people. So it's actually a really interesting question. So are the communities that you protect representative of solely human groups? Do the impacts on biodiversity or landscapes play a part in incentivizing the nations in improvement, or is it more on a human focus?
I mean, it's squarely focused on humans, but we have made attempts to go a little broader. The risk is if you go too broad, then suddenly you need an expansion, and the model becomes really complicated. But we do model a lot of like deforestation and so on. So you can see how generally in game speak, that's like the natural sequestration drops. So that's bad. We have biodiversity loss is like a sorry, that's my dog. A crisis card and so on. But yeah, even working with the World Wildlife Federation, trying to find the boundary of where the game should go, and say, yeah, really, we're focused on humans in this game, but trying to keep an eye toward other things as well.
Sounds like your dog is complaining about this human-centric approach to climate
totally.
change.
Totally.
Just looking down to see if there was anything else that was asked. We are sort of coming to the final minute, I suppose. So I guess a couple of the questions were suggesting, or comments suggesting, people wanting to play the game, which is obviously a good thing. And I suppose, could you tell us when's this game likely to appear? How can people get involved? And is it too late in the process? I guess you've already shared a link to sort of a playtest link. So what happens next with the project?
Yeah, we're expecting to have a Kickstarter this spring. So I haven't nailed down the exact date there, but keep an eye out for that. And then, yeah, trying to get the game out after that as fast as humanly possible. Given supply chain and all the things happening in the world, there's some uncertainty around that. But yeah, we'll certainly want to get it out in the world as quickly as we can.
That's fantastic. Well, thank
you. If you
go
to daybreakgame.org, you can sign up to get an email when we're launching the Kickstarter campaign. You can also follow our design log and get updates on our process. And if you want to play test, we'll be really happy to go to that link that we posted earlier about testing Daybreak online.
I'll just push it to one more question, because it's the question I threatened to ask, and Charlotte's asked the same question. Why is it called Daybreak?
Oh yeah, so yeah, we initially called it Climate Crisis, and then when we started working with our publisher CMYK, we did a naming exercise. We looked at different directions, and one that we wanted and that we've all agreed to go down to was to try and find a name and a visual aesthetic as well that has a hopeful outlook. And so of all the various names that we've been considering, Daybreak came out strong because it has an element of breaking with the past of climate inaction. So it signifies that when you play Daybreak, you're looking at a different kind of geopolitical global cooperation, and also it hints at a new day. It hints at the sun, which is a big part of the solution, or the energy sources. So it has this combination of really interesting and evocative themes that coming together. And it's also really short. We wanted a really short name, so not climate crisis, but something that you can say in a breath. So Daybreak.
It's great. Well, thank you